Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm a senior fellow with the CSIS Americas Program. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on cybersecurity, supply chains, and the development of Mexico's information communication technology, or ICT sector. Before we formally begin, let's take care of logistics. This event will last approximately 90 minutes, beginning with a fireside chat from our featured discussant, followed by a panel discussion. Following the featured discussion, panel remarks, and a moderated discussion, we will field questions from the audience. Please submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage. Again, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for an important conversation on cybersecurity, supply chains, and development of Mexico's ICT sector. Our conversation today builds upon the findings of a report published by CSIS last November that explored opportunities and challenges in Mexico's ICT sector. One of the key observations in this report was that as Mexico continues to digitalize, strong development of its ICT sector will be crucial to its success. Since 2013's landmark regulatory reform, which created the Federal Institute of Telecommunications, IFT, Mexico's telecommunications regulatory framework has become one of the most advanced in Latin America. Internet access has also increased dramatically throughout Mexico, with the number of mobile broadband connections more than tripling since 2013. However, the country has also struggled to foster competition and dynamism within the ICT space, leading in some cases to prohibitively high pricing that strands many on the wrong side of the digital divide. A significant complicating factor is that Mexico is the fourth largest cybercrime target in the Western Hemisphere, after the United States, Canada, and Brazil. Meanwhile, a recent report by Symantec has estimated that cybercrime and cyber fraud imposes a $7.7 billion cost on the Mexican economy each year. The majority of these attacks do not employ highly sophisticated methods and can be defeated through dedicated IT staffs and practical cybersecurity measures, as well as following international standards for IT protection. While cybersecurity poses significant risks, just 48% of Mexican companies state that adapting their operations for digital transformation is a priority. And fewer still have taken the necessary steps to address their digital vulnerabilities. Yet none of these challenges exists in a vacuum. Decades of close trade integration with the United States have also created a robust digital economy between the two countries. Meanwhile, cross-border electrical grids and other critical infrastructure mean that vulnerabilities in one country will inevitably create risks in the other. As Mexico and the United States navigate the new paradigm on security cooperation inaugurated by last October's bicentennial framework, cybersecurity will represent a key test of the ability of both countries to translate dialogue into actionable results. We will begin today with a fireside chat and conversation, followed by a panel-oriented discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce the experts who have joined the event today to help us unpack the future of the ICT sector, both in Mexico and through the lens of the bilateral relationship with the United States. Delivering our keynote during the fireside chat will be Juan Gonzalez, Special Advisor to President Joe Biden and the Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. From 2013 to 2015, he served as Special Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, during which he accompanied the Vice President on 7 visits to Latin America and coordinated the launch of the US-Mexico High-Level Economic Dialogue, the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, and the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle of Central America. Mr. Gonzalez, thank you very much for joining us today. And our panelist is Elena Estavillo, Chief Executive Officer of Centro I, the Society of the Future. Centro I is a think tank based in Mexico whose research focuses on exploring the economic and social ramifications of the digital ecosystem. Dr. Estavillo formerly served as a commissioner for the Federal Telecommunications Institute in Mexico. Her work has been featured in Forbes as well as the Global Competition Review. Dr. Estavillo, thank you for joining us today. I want to start the fireside chat portion of the event today. So Mr. Gonzalez, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for this opportunity. I know there was a lot of fanfare around the North American Leaders Summit, but I haven't had an opportunity actually to talk to folks at CSIS, and I know a lot of participants that are coming from the private sector, and I imagine from think tanks and even from other governments. And so I wanted to reflect a little bit on the outcomes of that visit as they relate to the topic today. And in some ways, I think the ICT space is the perfect space to have this conversation, given that when you talk about kind of the Mexican energy sector, that has been I think the flashpoint of a lot of the debates over U.S.-Mexico relations. But I think, frankly, making progress in the ICT space is an area that is a top priority for the López Obrador administration, one that we very much want to support. And so that opens an opportunity to talk about issues of competition policy, as you had mentioned. So not being an expert in the sector, I want to kind of give a broad kind of frame to really what we've been wanting to accomplish, and put a finer point, I think, over some areas of difference and maybe opportunity with between the United States and Mexico. So the first thing I'll say is that much like the visit of President López Obrador in July 2020 to Washington to meet with President Donald Trump, the focus of the visit and the meeting here was migration. That has been the kind of central topic. It's the reason that during the transition, Mexico was the only government that during the transition we engaged on policy issues. And what we have found is, of course, that the interests between the United States and Mexico have been aligned on matters of migration, and we've had very excellent cooperation, since January on this topic. But in some ways, the expectations for the López Obrador visit to Washington were much higher, and certainly our expectations were higher because, as Vice President, you mentioned, Ryan, that Joe Biden was the person that inaugurated and presided over the high-level economic dialogue. We also, I think, recognize that we have a much broader and a kind of growing litany of interests, and I would say irritants as well, with Mexico, whether it's climate and energy policy, whether it's security cooperation, and obviously the implementation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. We had a much broader definition of success for the visit. And if I were to say, look back on 2021, I would say that what we've succeeded in doing is establishing these mechanisms for institutional cooperation that had been dormant for some time. We've used it to, I think, successfully overcome some areas of differences and set a very clear path forward. For example, with the bicentennial framework on security cooperation, I think that the metric for 2022 is how we can really define a strategic vision for U.S.-Mexico relations, recognizing that the security and prosperity of Mexico is fundamentally in the national security interest of the United States. So successful visit, a lot of work to do. The other point I'd mention is just, when we've approached the Mexico relationship under this administration, we've done it with a couple set of principles or values in mind. The first is that Canada and Mexico are indispensable partners for the United States as we try to recover economically, try to combat the pandemic. And frankly, as we think about the competitiveness, global competitiveness of the United States, the North American platform is indispensable toward that. And that's the first one. The second is that there is a genuine interest, and we've seen that borne out in the conversation we've had with Secretary Ebrard, the engagements that the president has had with López Obrador, the vice president has had with López Obrador. Jake Sullivan and I traveled to Mexico last year, had the opportunity to meet with López Obrador and had a long conversation where there was alignment that we seek to define a strategic relationship that responds to some of the modern challenges that we're facing. And that's, obviously it's important to recognize that NAFTA, when it was originated, was an experiment. And there, I think, debates in the United States, but also in Mexico, and I imagine in Canada, over issues of trade policy that folks may agree with or disagree with, but they're a reality, and these debates that we're trying to have. The final point is that that we agree with the López Obrador administration's, I think, assessment of a lot of the challenges that Mexico's having, and indeed, we have similar challenges here in the United States. Issues of inequality. I think obviously the business environment and the need for us to really invest in working families are areas where this president really is fully aligned with López Obrador. But at the same time, we have differences over how to execute on addressing those aims. And so let me kind of put a finer point on. When we are, if you take a step back and look at how the pandemic has aggravated these, I think, structural impediments to prosperity in Latin America and the Caribbean, whether it's a feeble business environment, lack of governance, weak institutions, and in some cases, short-sighted governments, inequality, a dependence on commodities at a time when the world is undergoing a global energy transition. And I think relevant to the conversation today, a slow pace of technological progress. These are issues where the United States cannot solve these challenges, but it is fundamentally in our interest to help Mexico resolve them. But for us, what I would say is areas of difference are that I think the first one would be is that we do not think that industrial policy and competition policy are mutually exclusive. So we understand that that the Mexican government seeks a stronger role, for example, for its national oil companies, for its electricity utility, and others, and that is fine. But we see that there's a way to do it so that you don't discourage private investment. Fundamentally, the most important economic actors in Mexico are U.S. companies, and we want to make sure that we create the environment where those economies are invested. The second is that independent regulators are key, and that they have, I think there may be much debate over what the Peña Nieto administration did, but on its face, they followed best practices when it came to whether it's in the energy sector or ICT sector to establish independent regulators that would foment competition, but also create a space for the government to actually maybe create endemic industries. So again, going back to industrial and competition policy not being mutually exclusive. Specifically, a point on the ICT sector, there have been many conversations that the President López Obrador and President Biden, and frankly, it's something that the Vice President is been a leader on here in the United States and is thinking about this issue in Mexico, and that is the deployment of broadband to rural areas in southern Mexico. But when you look at how you actually respond to that challenge, it is ineffective to do it without the involvement and the support of the private sector. If you have an environment where there's one company that owns 60% of the market, it discourages investment. And it also, there's a disincentive for that company to invest in rural areas where they're not going to receive a return. If there's not a very clear competition policy, then companies, U.S. companies, are not going to take the risk of actually investing and deploying that infrastructure. And ultimately, what we want is to create the environment where, with the Mexican government, the U.S. government can facilitate a role for the private sector to deliver on broadband to kind of southern Mexico. Fundamentally, that's absolutely in our interest. Finally, I would say that, but the approach that we have taken, recognizing that, I think Mexico, if you study its history, has had kind of U.S. businesses have had a complicated history with Mexico. The approach that we have taken, whether it's in the energy sector, that's during Secretary Granholm's recent visit to Mexico, having a candid but respectful dialogue with the Mexican government, but also coming at these problem sets from a reservoir of goodwill where we are trying to offer the technical assistance, the support, and engaging constructively in a dialogue to try to arrive at win-win scenarios, recognizing that we are not going to agree on everything, but no great powers ever agree on everything, but having these mechanisms in order to break through these issues in a way that I think provides guarantees to the private sector that their investments will be safe and that they can do what I've heard some companies say they can do well by doing good in places like Mexico. And I guess the final point I'll say is that as we are engaging and trying to be responsive to I think what is this I think vision by López Obrador to address historic inequalities, to be responsive and promote economic growth and prosperity in southern Mexico, which I think rightly has been left behind by kind of the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship. We need to have an active dialogue with private sector stakeholders from all sides, and that's why the U.S.-Mexico high-level economic dialogue envisions a very robust stakeholder mechanism, because ultimately you are the ones that are innovating in the private sector. We need to hear your perspectives, and obviously we have a trade agreement that really governs how we can actually maneuver inside the space. Because ultimately, I think if you get to a point where there is a kind of USMCA mechanism for dispute, at that point I feel like we've exhausted every effort at dialogue, and I think it's in our interest to try to avoid that in the interest of the prosperity of Mexico and the United States. So bottom line here is really look forward to an active dialogue. I really appreciate Ryan and CSIS pulling this together. And again, want to issue the disclaimer that I am not the expert in ICT that you and my fellow panelists are, but really look forward to engaging in this debate and taking away from the conversation as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Juan, thanks so much. That's a really useful set of remarks on the bilateral relationship and where we're at, and some areas of cooperation and also some areas of potential difference. I wanted to ask you, sort of sticking within this framework of bilateral relations as a way of looking at the ICT sector, asking you a specific question about USMCA. And it's because it took an important step forward with its inclusion of a chapter on the digital economy. This was a big difference in renegotiating NAFTA. Looking back now, what progress has been made since the signing of USMCA toward supporting trade in the digital sphere, and what do you think needs to be done? What remains to be done in this space?
Well, look, what I think is, and as we saw from the pandemic, and conversations I've had with you, Ryan, of course, the pandemic has, I think accentuated the socioeconomic divide that exists in a lot of countries, because Latin America has had school closures that are much longer than the OECD average, and there are schools that have access to virtual learning and those that don't. Young people and vulnerable populations, I think specifically women, have borne the brunt of a loss of access to education. And so the conversations that we have with Mexico around kind of digital connectivity have been around access to education by providing the necessary infrastructure to create that environment. And I'll admit that aside from the kind of trade space that is the normal course of the conversations led by USTR, we have sought to use the high-level economic dialogue as a way to really galvanize those conversations. So one of those that has been, I think, fundamental has been, number one, has been a supply chain working group, the first that we have done with any other country in the world. And a central point of that has been on microprocessors as an effort to develop a shared platform. The others, and you spoke to the issue of cybersecurity. I know I'm jumping around. Is we've integrated, as you mentioned, the issue of cybersecurity into the bicentennial framework for U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. And that has led to conversations between security forces in the United States, whether it's CISA or even kind of the role of the State Department and their counterparts to try to find ways to either to align standards. We have obviously ISO standards, which are I think fundamental, or making sure that we're creating a space to allow the private sector to kind of help us prioritize how this cabinet level dialogue can really be one that accelerates dialogue on a whole host of issues related to digital connectivity.
Thanks, Juan. I wanted to pick up on the bicentennial framework bit because security is strongly in our wheelhouse at CSIS, and note, of course, that cybersecurity formed a critical part of that. Give us a sense of where those conversations are on cyber, how they're going, any differences or similarities we might have there, and how the overall state of cyber cooperation is going, because I think this is something very interesting for our audience.
Well, great. No, what I'll say is, so there was a meeting recently of the kind of bicentennial framework. We have a long to-do list that was developed. The goal, as I mentioned, for 2021 was to set up the structure. Now for 2022, what we want to do is prioritize. And so the meeting that took place earlier this week was to try to finalize a work plan that could set out very clear, achievable objectives for us to undertake between the United States and Mexico. And that, of course, outside of the kind of cyber and ICT space, are focused on kind of the financial resources of organized crime, the supply chains, questions of arms trafficking, but then on the cyber side, recognizing that it's an area where we have to set very clear common goals. The other is also, I think a recognition in the U.S., and I would say that this is in its initial stages, is recognizing that the vulnerability of Mexico's infrastructure is the vulnerability of the United States. In some cases, you have fiber optic that is shared between the United States and Mexico, and so ensuring that they are safeguarding their infrastructure has been something that we're seeking to prioritize. So I could be wrong, but I think our intention is to announce a work plan for the bicentennial framework. There may have been fact sheets already, but it's to set kind of very clear goals that that allows think tanks, the private sectors, and others to engage.
Great, Juan, thanks. And picking up right where you mentioned about the connectivity between Mexico and the United States, I think we've both watched cybercrime pick up dramatically during the pandemic. What are some of the emerging trends that we're seeing in the cybersecurity landscape between Mexico and the U.S.? Take us through some of those vulnerabilities that the high-level security dialogue and bicentennial framework would be dealing with.
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is not my area of expertise, so I'll confess that I won't be able to have too many specifics on this, but it's in areas where we're trying to make sure that the kind of the standards that we have in place, that we have found as effective as possible to safeguarding our infrastructure and be able to combat cybercrime and combat hacks, are ones that we are hopefully kind of aligning on our standards with Mexico. I think has been an area of priority. And then, obviously, as we have with the pandemic and with other issues, making sure that we have a very kind of active information sharing process as it relates to any sort of challenges or hacks on their side, so that we could try to be responsive to them and share best practices. So not a great answer to your question, but it's an area that we're certainly prioritizing as a part of our work plan for 2022.
Great, thanks, Juan. I think what I want to do is turn it from what's been kind of like a fireside chat and bring in Dr. Estavillo, who's able to run circles around both of us in the technical space, and give you a chance to provide some opening remarks, context, and also Dr. Estavillo, feel free to respond to anything that Juan and I have been talking about. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much to you. and to CSIS for this invitation and to participate in this panel. It's a pleasure to share with you, Juan Gonzalez and Ryan Berg. Well, there are lots of issues to talk about, but in these initial remarks, I will focus on some of them. I hope that in the following discussion, we'll get to address some of the others. I want to point out to your report, the CSIS report on the development on the ICT landscape in Mexico and cybersecurity and opportunities for investment, because it gives us a very good immersion in important challenges that Mexico faces to strengthen its digital ecosystem, especially in terms of cybersecurity and looking at this in our framework as trade partners. I found very interesting and useful to focus on strengths and weaknesses in order to define policy recommendations. And without a doubt, our trade agreement, and particularly Chapter 19 on digital trade, is a very solid forward-looking framework. It contains ICT provisions such as electronic authentication, online consumer protection, cross-border transfer of information, and cooperation on issues of cybersecurity. And I agree that these conditions make our countries more attractive destinations for ICT sector investment. These are plus, these are strengths. I would also mention Chapter 18, telecommunications, because it complements and strengthens the obligations to support digital trade. This chapter sets commitments for Mexico, for example, to maintain an independent regulatory authority with the purpose of regulating and promoting competition and efficient development of telecommunications. This reflects our current situation and constitutional mandates, but also gives certainty about the permanence of this institutional framework for telecommunications and competition. And now, in order to be able to take full advantage of this trade agreement, we have to work towards the digitalization and cybersecurity of supply chains. Mexico has a very uneven pattern of development. There are very productive, competitive, smoothly integrated sectors with the North American market, mainly the manufacturing activities and, for example, the automotive industry. These sectors are digitized and are adopting exponential technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence. But at the same time, there are other sectors which have been lagging behind in digitalization and consequently in adoption of other exponential technologies like data analytics. Even within more modern and technified sectors, small and medium enterprises are generally less digitized. The big challenge is that supply chains or supply ecosystems become completely digitized and with sufficient levels of cybersecurity throughout all of their components, which include companies in different economic activities and different sizes, as well as logistics services and customers, public authorities, and services. So these are very large supply ecosystems that we have to work into. Trust in a supply ecosystem depends on the level of trust in every one of its parts. So digitalization and cybersecurity strategies have to be tailored to the specific needs and circumstances of modern and technified sectors, as well as traditional ones that have poor digital readiness, and for big international companies, as well as small local enterprises. For similar reasons, from the consumer viewpoint, there is neither a single digital inclusion solution. We need to develop specific strategies, for example, with the gender scope, but also others focusing on the elderly, on indigenous populations, people with disabilities, etc. Small and medium enterprises and small local governments also require specific digital policies. I want to comment also on the lack of a digital mindset as one of the obstacles for digitalization that the CSIS document underlines. This is a very true and challenging reality. To meet this challenge, it is not only necessary to invest in human and physical capital, but to design strategies to induce innovation processes in SMEs that transform their internal processes and business models. A digital mindset is also absent in the government, who shows a general lack of interest and awareness of what digitalization and cybersecurity mean for national development and welfare, which translates into a general disregard for digital issues. And I think that this is a very, very big challenge for us. The government's austerity policies are not applied with the same emphasis across all sectors, but rather it has translated into shifting of public resources to a very compact set of priorities where there has been no room for digital transformation. Not to this moment. I hope that this space will open. Not only the public pledge to austerity, but also this lack of a digital mindset explain the numerous budget cuts and elimination of professional profiles, and also that we still do not have a national digital strategy. There is a document that has this title, but it really is not what we would expect of a national digital strategy, a strategy to transform all of our society and economic and social relations to a digital standard. Governments have a critical role in digital transformation, not only as makers of public policy, regulating and enforcing, but in becoming digital entities and thus turning themselves in part of an enabling ecosystem. For example, digitizing public services gives citizens and enterprises a reason to digitize themselves. Entities responsible for the provision of essential public services for the population, such as education, health, and justice, have an important role to play in digital transformation. But we know that the pandemic exposed the public sector's deep digital shortcomings. Numerous entities in Mexico were really paralyzed by the lack of preparation in infrastructure and digital services, but also because of the rigidity of processes and culture to adapt to the virtual ecosystem, that is the digital mindset. Some developed electronic procedures and remote work mechanisms. Others are strengthening their cybersecurity, but efforts are uneven and there are no visible guidelines for transformation. And in fact, we can see that an important part of the public sector has simply got to doing things the way they used to, because they never envisage permanent changes to start with. So far, I will stop here with my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Estavillo. I have a couple follow-ups to your pretty wide-ranging remarks and comments on the report that we released last year. I want to ask you first about this dramatic expansion throughout Mexico of access to the internet, which did take place and has taken place over the last couple of years, but also the fact that the pandemic has laid bare that there hasn't been enough digitization in a very stark way. And so what do we need? What steps are needed from a policy, a private sector, and a bilateral perspective to ensure that greater and greater numbers of Mexicans gain access to secure and reliable internet? This is something that Juan mentioned in his remarks, dovetails with US interests, right? Bringing more internet to places that have historically not had it, for example, southern Mexico. So what do we need to do from the policy, private sector, and bilateral perspective to ensure that stable and secure access for greater numbers of Mexicans?
Yes, it's a reality. though in recent years we have jumped from a rough 40% of penetration around 2013, 2014. Now we have a penetration of access to internet around 70% of the population. But the digital divide remains very wide in Mexico. It reflects our economic and social divides. We're a very unequal country, but it should not be taken as a given. On the contrary, bridging the digital divide can help us to close other inequalities. But this will not happen spontaneously. We need specific actions and strategies. Some of the causes that maintain people disconnected are shared among different groups, excluded groups, for example, low income and lack of coverage. But other factors are specific, or they affect people in different ways. For example, for women and diverse persons, digital violence is a powerful factor that refrains them from using the internet. I would point to three main action spaces for digital inclusion. One is affordability of services and devices. This may require direct financial support to families and businesses, which we have not seen. And this is very important. And also specifically on devices, affordable devices are seldomly considered in digital strategies in Mexico. And this is a very important obstacle for people to access for these services. Another action space is digital literacy and relevant content. We need tailored content so these different excluded groups are interested and find a reason to search for connection. The other space would be accessibility of services and devices for thinking on people with different needs. For example, for persons with disabilities, for the elderly, for speakers of different native languages. And I would include here also the ease of use for people with scarce digital skills. And finally, gendered online violence. This is a very important reason for people to maintain themselves out of virtual spaces. And they might have access to the internet, but are not using it as deeply, or they cannot profit from all the opportunities that might give them internet use. Digitalization strategies must have a gender lens. This is very important to ensure that women effectively take advantage of telecommunications as a tool for economic and social inclusion, and that they bring innovation to the economic landscape. Gender equality not only means benefits for women in society, but also for the economy. We have increasing evidence of how women's participation drives productivity, profitability, and innovation, especially disruptive innovation, not only in the perspective of products and markets, but also in the way of facing uncertainty and change, which is very valuable in this moment. Now, digitalization is a multi-part task. It requires the participation of the public and private sectors, also of the academic and scientific community, as well as social organizations. In the realm of our trade agreement, collaboration is fundamental. The digital industry has, of course, a role and responsibility to invest and to extend network coverage and capacity, driving widespread technology adoption. To be inclusive, it must have a wide coverage of the populations in the different regions and affordable prices and accessible service, accessible equipment. And I think that companies also need to tailor their commercial offers to different groups of the population and to make available services, content, and devices that favor their inclusion. But that is, we have to see and to accept that even the richest countries, which is not the case of Mexico, require the government to act where the market does not reach. But the efficiency and innovation of companies is needed to extend as much as possible the frontiers of the market. Not only them, but we need a competition conditions so that enterprises can fulfill their part. And why? Because this is what should permit us to minimize the margin of disconnected people and entities that need access to public resources. So competition is essential to attain this. Other important players for digitalization are businesses in general, which will have to adopt technologies to process large amounts of information in order to improve decision processes, which could redefine business models. Industries have to adopt digitalization to incorporate greater use of robotics to improve efficiency and also increase the use of artificial intelligence tools so that they keep being productive and competitive. Just like we need to close digital divides inside our country to bring about sustainable growth paths for the long term, it is fundamental to work towards bridging the digital divide across North America so that we can better work together and strengthen trade. There's an enormous opportunity there for bilateral and multilateral collaboration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Estavillo. Incredibly thorough answer, which went through a lot: cost and affordability, digital literacy, accessibility, and devices, and then of course a gendered lens to the digital divide. Juan, I want to bring you back into the conversation here to comment on anything you just heard. And Dr. Estavillo gave this marvelous and very comprehensive answer. My question to you is just, how is the U.S. government's policy and approach? What is the U.S. government doing for bridging the digital divide, and give us a sense of how the Biden administration's approach is helping to further digital inclusion? Any sorts of points of synergy that you feel that you have with Dr. Estavillo's very comprehensive answer?
Yeah, certainly, Dr. Estavillo, very much appreciated your intervention. Look, I think I would say two things. The first is, of course, domestically here in the United States, the Biden-Harris administration is making probably the largest investment in infrastructure since the Johnson administration. A lot of that is focused on these very same issues to ensure that everybody has access to broadband internet as a tool for to reduce inequality and provide economic opportunity. There are two elements of that for us. Number one is an element of having a national strategy, which I understand at this point Mexico does not have, even though they have Internet para Todos as a strategy. And so for us, the engagements that you've seen from, in the energy sector, you're going to see a regular, I think, stream of high-level engagement with Mexico to try to align on issues of strategy, of standards, of regulations as a key element of competition, and to support the Lopez Obrador's administration's undertaking to provide internet for all. The other is, I think Dr. Estavillo mentioned as well, is making clear that there is an iterative engagement with the private sector. So trade missions that allow an opportunity for us to engage with the government and have the private sector have a seat at the table is going to be, I think, key. One key point, Ryan, that you mentioned in your report is making sure that we're also including academia as a stakeholder in this process. Certainly, Mexico has some of the best universities, I think, in the hemisphere, if not the world, that can play an incredibly important role. And then the last one, I think, is, of course, making sure that we are aligned with the agreements in USMCA. And I think particularly when it comes to auctions, making sure that that they follow a certain standard. Because if you have auctions that are on the market for 4 days and are written for the benefit of Huawei, that's really not consistent with USMCA. You want to try to have something that falls under the standards that are set under USMCA, so that we're creating that environment and that predictability for the private sector investment. But this is it is a process where I think if we can align on strategy, having high-level engagement by our governments can be something that can break through bureaucratic logjams or impediments to cooperation and bring us closer toward harmonization and alignment on digital strategy.
Thanks very much, Juan. Dr. Estavillo, I want to go back to you, but before I go back to you, I want to remind our audience on the event webpage, there's a button. If you are interested in asking a live question, please click on it, fill in the box with your question. They come to me. I'm monitoring the chat now, as well as the Ask Live Questions button. So we'll get to your Q&A in a minute. But Dr. Estavillo, first, I want to ask you about the IFT specifically. This is in your wheelhouse. You used to be a commissioner on the IFT in Mexico. The López Obrador administration has suggested that the IFT's regulatory powers be consolidated along with those of other agencies. What are the risks associated with such a merger, and how might the United States have a productive dialogue with the Mexican government about the need for a stronger ICT regulatory power? This is something that's been a pretty major conversation in this space for some time.
Yes, of course, this is a very important issue. And there was already an attempt to reform the Constitution in order to rearrange the IFT and also other independent authorities like the Competition Commission. The objective of this initiative that it was already presented was to extinguish the Federal Institute of Telecommunications, the IFT, and the Federal Commission of Economic Competition, as well as the Energy Regulatory Commission, to give rise to a new regulator in competition authority that would also be an autonomous constitutional body, but all these responsibilities were to be under the same roof and with very substantially diminished resources. At that time, many voices concerned about the future of these authorities expressed their concerns. NGOs, former regulators like myself, academics, specialists in telecommunications, media and competition, and also human rights and freedom of speech activists. A few days later, a few weeks later, after numerous letters, petitions, public statements, interviews, forums, etc., the initiative was withdrawn. It is not clear whether this initiative was completely abandoned or might resort. I hope this will not happen. A big rejection was evident against any weakening or reformulation that threatens these constitutional bodies. We are aware that the construction of institutions is a long and progressive process. We need to learn to correct, to strengthen, and not to return to the starting point. Disappearing or weakening the IFT would be a setback in institutional building in which we have advanced over many years. The proposal that was presented underlined the argument of administrative savings, austerity, but we argued that a considerable social cost would come out of this due to the loss of effectiveness in fulfilling the mandates of the IFT, of the Competition Commission, because it's about protecting human rights, of closing the digital divide, protecting consumers and competition. The creation of the IFT in 2013 as as a competition authority, this is very important to know because it's particular of our institutional design. The IFT is a regulator, but also is the competition authority for all these services. It's specialized in telecommunications, and this design did not come out of nowhere. This was a response to long years of frustration in attempts to improve competition in the sector. The case of the IFT is also unique because its specialization is not only due to the technological aspects of electronic communications or the digital ecosystem, but also because it is in charge of protecting human rights. Access to the internet, as well as information and communication technologies, are enablers of fundamental rights, such as health, education, work, justice, political and association rights. Also, access to the internet is defined in our Constitution as a fundamental right. Likewise, in the electronic media, the right to information, freedom of speech, the right to culture, diversity, and plurality must be warranted. And the IFT is in charge of these rights. Extinguishing or weakening the warranted body would run counter to the constitutional principle of progressivity of human rights. And this would undermine the institutionalization of democratic and citizen processes. Eliminate or profoundly change authorities can damage trust also in public institutions, which is critical to maintaining incentives for investment, to innovation, and creating jobs. I should also comment that the IFT and the Competition Commission are successful models that other countries, notably those in Latin America, see as role models. They have been recognized by organizations such as the International Telecommunications Union and the International Competition Network. Also, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement states that we should maintain a telecommunications regulatory body which is autonomous from the executive branch of government, that is independent regarding its decisions and functioning, and has the purpose of regulating and promoting competition and efficient development of telecommunications. I feel that we have all this background, the trade agreement, the role of the IFT as a protector of human rights, and our constitutional mandate to work in maintaining these authorities. And yes, our trade relations are pertaining to the North American region is also a way of putting forward that the mere existence of this institution is gives us a strength to attract investment, to be trusted as a government, as the public institutions, to give certainty, to give trust, so that we can build an economic relationships to promote this working together. So working in all these aspects, dimensions, I believe that we have very strong arguments to defend the permanence and existence of the IFT.
Thank you very much, Dr. Estavillo. Juan, I'm very conscious of the time. I know you've got something to jump to at 3 p.m. So I just want to give you a final chance to make any final intervention, any final remarks that you might have. And of course, we thank you very much for joining the panel.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much, Ryan, for this opportunity. And thank you, Dr. Estavillo, for your remarks. Look, what I'll say is, when we look at some of these issues, and just to your question on IFT, I think the first question we ask ourselves is, first is, what is the framework under which we operate that being the USMCA, and be able to discern between the kind of legal binding agreement that we have with Mexico, and in some cases debates that are either political or that really are ones that the Mexican people should have among each other. I think that's incredibly important because the United States did not vote in the Mexican election, and we are not political actors inside of Mexico. The second point is that, and this is I'm paraphrasing actually the conversation the president had with President Lopez Obrador, was that the U.S. economy is growing at a pace that it has not in decades, and the president and vice president are making historic investments in U.S. infrastructure, particularly along this sector, and that it is in our interest to be aligned with Mexico for the benefit of both the United States and Mexico. That is much easier if we can find ways of alignment. We can create an environment where we're both investing in working families, but also having clear competition policy that allows the private sector to have to be able to invest with certainty. It is easier for us to find that alignment than to have to work through areas of disagreement. But a lot of that for us it means navigating some of these conversations which are candid or constructive in private. And some of these conversations we have sometimes as an open debate because we're not the only stakeholders in a good U.S.-Mexico relationship. So, I say all that to say that this is a process, it'll be dynamic. And I think we look forward to continuing to engage with, CSIS, which has been a wealth of research and information, but also with the Mexican government, with the private sector, to try to make sure that we get this right. And so really thanks again for pulling this together. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks.
Juan Gonzalez, the Special Advisor to President Joe Biden and the Senior Director for Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council. Thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate your time. Okay, Dr. Estavillo, we have some questions pouring in, but the first thing I want to do is just use moderator's privilege to ask one more question of you while we start collating questions. And folks, remember there's an Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage. We see some questions coming in already and we're about to get to them. But the last question I have for the moderated portion of this event is, how can the Mexican private sector, we've heard, both of you have talked about the private sector, we've heard a lot about the role of the private sector here. How do we better incorporate it into these conversations about digital transformation and cybersecurity?
Very important to incorporate all of the private sector in these discussions. And the more difficult part is to incorporate those that do not have yet this interest, that have not a digital mindset, that do not see what is in for them for digitalizing. And so I believe that there needs to, we need to construct a tailored strategy to bring to the table this kind of enterprises, which are, many of them are in some specific sectors, which are more traditional, more physical, and that continue to work in the same manner even through the pandemic. And so it is difficult. So we have to tailor. It is not the same challenge to talk to a modern sector, to big companies, than to talk and to incite this interest in small enterprises. And here we need to share good practices, to learn together, to show them how to profit from these processes, and to give them some helpful advice. In some cases, maybe walk them through the processes of digitalization. And this, I believe that these are sector specific because they are sectors that are more traditional than others. And size specific, very small enterprises have lots of difficulties to get into digitalization. And they don't understand what they can get out of this. Sometimes they do not understand how to digitize, and they lose time, they lose money, and they don't get any side of the benefits. So yes, we have to make special efforts to attain this part of the industry.
Thank you, Dr. Estavillo. The first question that we've got from the audience is about the López Obrador administration, which you've mentioned itself doesn't seem to have too much of a digital mindset. And the question is, why has the AMLO administration been reluctant to prioritize a cyber strategy when it's trying to expand internet access? How do we square the circle?
Oh, I think that it is necessary to hear specialists on these issues, because the first time that we get into these themes of digitalization, of access to internet, what we think about is that the problem is that some places in our country have not access, there is no coverage of networks. But the reality is that we have a very extended coverage of networks, and the problems of access are way more complex. There are many places where there is coverage, but maybe there's not enough competition. We have only one provider, so people don't get the best of services, the best of quality, and the best of prices. And these places are also where people with very scarce resources live. So they have an economic problem, an income problem, and they also get to have a market that is very concentrated, so they don't get the best of the market. But this is not the only problem. They don't have digital skills. They don't get contents that are tailored to their interests, to their needs. People, for example, that don't speak Spanish or speak very bad Spanish, that need to have content in their own language. And this needs the help of specialists that work together in an integrated strategy. Is not only to build networks. This is very important. Physical capital is very important, but we need many things else. And all these components are not in the sight of the federal executive. As, for example, Internet for everyone, Internet para todos, is based only on extending the coverage of networks, but nothing besides that. And we need all the other components.
Thank you, Dr. Estavillo. I've got a very interesting question about Mexico's education system that's come in, and it's prompted, I think, by your remark about the preparedness or lack thereof of many Mexican students for digital futures. And so somebody has asked, how do you see the performance of Mexico's secondary and tertiary educations in preparing youth for jobs in the ICT sector? In what ways are they strong, and in what ways could they improve? So are they doing anything well, and where do they need to improve?
Well, in this subject, we also have very big inequalities. We are in a very sad situation because the pandemic has brought about very big costs in terms of educational inclusion. many children had gotten out of school. They didn't have the resources that were needed to keep them in the educational system. So now we have a very big burden on these generations of children and of youth. We also have the other side of the picture. We have, because I'm talking mainly of public education, but in other cases of private education, there was a part of the population that had the skills, that had the resources to continue their education in the digital realm. But that's one of the cases that I talked about, that where the public institutions did not have a clear vision of what it meant to get to the digital side of the education. Maybe this was seen as a passage of some months and to recuperate easily afterwards. We had a public system of classes through the television, and this was the capacities of television programs to keep the education of children were very, very limited. We should have to initiate a digitalization, which is a very complex procedure. It's not only to translate analogic contents into the digital side, to read the same from books to online services. No, we have to go through a very deep transformation of educational processes to profit from all the resources that the digital world can give to us, but we have not gotten through this process.
Thank you, Dr. Estavillo. There's a question that just came in, and it's a response to something that you said in one of your previous responses to a question. And it's about the role of the private sector and foreign governments to convince the AMLO administration or persuade the AMLO administration that the challenges of the digital divide are more than just about coverage. Is there a way to persuade this administration? If so, how?
Yes, I think that we can do it. It's not easy, but we can do it. And one of the strengths that we can point to is that digitalization is a very powerful tool for economic recuperation and for social recuperation. We have very large costs of the pandemics in social and economic terms. And we can use many digital tools, not only to go back to where we stood before, but to start new models of development that this government is very keen for. This government is very interested on reducing poverty, on looking for economic and social inclusion. So all digitalization can be used for that. If we reduce digital divides, for example, this can help us close other divides, regional divides, gender divides, rural divides. And I think that this message, if we get through this message, then all this digital phenomena can be seen not as a gadget, not as something that is out of our reality, but as a real tool for economic growth, for social inclusion.
Thank you, Dr. Estavillo. There's a question that came in for Juan because it's about the Biden administration, but I'm going to use moderator's privilege and turn it into a question for you, Dr. Estavillo, and it's about China and it's about Huawei. And so I don't think you imagined coming to the event today without getting away without having to answer a question, at least one, about China and about Huawei. The question is that in the US and in the UK, the debate on the dependence on China-based tech companies for deployment of 5G tends to look at when should we block or when should we forbid the company from bidding on telecom infrastructure. But in Mexico, the questioner asks, almost all of the public and private investment in deploying a 5G network is fully dependent on Huawei and other Chinese companies. So what is the level of risk here in your opinion? And again, I'm moving it from a Biden administration question to one for Dr. Estavillo.
Yes, of course. This is a very difficult issue. Why? Because Chinese equipment and technology has a very large cost advantage. And for a country like Mexico, this is very important. We need lots of investment and we have limited resources. So the cost advantage is very attractive. But we also need to be worrying about cybersecurity. It entails other costs, maybe not immediate, very short run costs, but we have to look at all these issues, not only for the government. I think that also as citizens, we have to be very interested in cybersecurity. It has to do about our privacy, about our security, about our freedom in many ways. But yes, we have to be very sensitive to the cost issue. We have regions in our country, very large groups of people that have no access to internet, so they will be lagging behind in a very costly way in terms of personal lives. So yes, I think that this issue needs to be addressed in a very integral fashion, so that we take these two sides of the question and try to get some solution.
Thank you, Dr. Estavillo. And there's one final question, and then we've addressed them all, and it's about your remarks regarding cost and increasing access. You've mentioned that bringing down the price of hardware, specifically mobile phones, is integral to increasing access. Go into a little bit more depth on that. The person who's asking the question would like to know, what does that look like? Are you suggesting government needs-based subsidies or maybe some other approach? What are some of the top solutions to increasing access to hardware?
Yes, I'm convinced that we need public resources dedicated to this and a need-based way to assign these resources. We need those. There has been for a long time, nobody wants to talk about this because resources are scarce, because of worrying also on competition issues. You know, if we have free handsets, then what will happen to our market for handsets? I know this, we have to be very careful, but there are groups of people that will never get access to the internet if they don't get a device, and devices are very costly. There are groups of people that will never have enough resources to buy for themselves a device, or maybe a large family will have one device, but not everyone. So if there are children that need to study, if there are people to need to work from their home, they will have only one device. and it will not be sufficient. And also, not only this needs-based support from the government, but to look for devices that are not so costly. And we have not had that kind of strategies in Mexico. There are other countries that have looked into that. For example, in India, we have to look for low-cost devices for these parts of the population, but also being carefully not to maintain them on the other side of the digital divide, because these devices do not let them perform some processes to have access to important applications or content. No, we need to find or to produce these low-cost devices, but with enough capabilities that help people to be included in this digital transformation.
Thank you, Dr. Estavillo. We've gotten through all of the questions that have been put in the chat box, as well as the Ask Live questions function. And so what I want to do now is give you a few minutes if you want to make any closing remarks or any conclusions on what we've discussed and what we've heard today.
Thank you. Well, my last remarks would only be that these are very valuable efforts. I believe that we have the same objectives: to close divides, to get investment, to have a better integration in our production chains across the region. So there are lots to think, to work together, and also to have this common mindset that there are common benefits for all of us. So there is interest from every side to get these benefits, to produce these real benefits, and to also close the divide. The divide is not only inside our country, the divide is along our region in North America, and it's in our interest also to look for closing those divides.
Thank you very much, Dr. Estavillo, for being here today. I think we've identified that closing the digital divide and the role of Mexico's ICT sector in that is a critical issue. And I think at CSIS, we plan to do more work, or we hope to do more work on this in the future. And it's clearly something that the administration of Joe Biden is planning on continuing to work on in its bilateral relationship with Mexico. So thank you very much, Dr. Elena Estavillo, Chief Executive Officer of Centro I for the Society of the Future and former Commissioner of the Federal Telecommunications Institute, for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much to our audience as well. Everyone, take care.